had all this intro prepared. It feels redundant. Good evening.
Hello.
Welcome to Cedar Lane Unitarian Universalist Church. I'm Abhi Janamanchi. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm honored to serve this religious community as senior minister. And I am delighted and thrilled that you're with us here for this historic and significant gathering. Whoever you are, whomever you love, wherever you are on life's journey, whatever is your nationality and gender identity and immigration status, religious beliefs, and political affiliation, you are welcome here. Before I introduce our speaker, who needs no introduction, I would like to take a moment to recognize any public officials and or their staff who are here tonight with us. If you would please rise or raise your hand so we may see you and recognize you. Welcome. 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 And I would also like to recognize members of the media who are here with us. We're so glad to have you with us on a Sunday evening. Thank you for being here. And I want to recognize all of you for being here this evening, especially because your presence to me, and I'm being a bit presumptive here, indicates your concern for and commitment to the pursuit of truth. And here in this place, we welcome the light of truth, honesty, and transparency that this moment affords, despite the crisis that we are facing, the moment that affords our country whatever may be revealed. Now, people wonder at times as to why a religious community like Cedar Lane hosts these kinds of political events. So let me just explain to you why we do these things. We are holding this event tonight because one of our faith principles is to affirm and promote the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process in all social relations. While it may seem unusual for a religious body to include a commitment for a political method in its defining principles, it is also recognizing that democracy is more than a mechanism of governance. It is to us an act of faith. Not faith that any one point of view is right or anyone has copyright on truth or that that view will prevail, but faith that the will of the people will point us towards Dr. King's vision of the beloved community where all are welcome. And for us, democracy is a religious practice. And like other religious practices, it requires our working at it. It doesn't happen automatically because it contains within it the possibility of personal and social transformation that calls us to be engaged thoughtfully, respectfully, critically, and being open to wherever a responsible search for truth and meaning will lead us. So that, my friends, is in a nutshell why we are doing this here tonight. And now I would like to introduce and welcome back for the fourth time to Cedar Lane, Congressman Jamie Raskin. May I go through?
Oh.
Yes. Congressman Raskin is the U.S. representative of Maryland's 8th Congressional District, which includes Montgomery, Carroll, and Frederick counties. He is a constitutional scholar and was a professor of constitutional law for more than a quarter century at American University Washington College of Law before entering Congress. He is currently serving his second term as a key member of the Judiciary and House Oversight committees, which are engaged in carrying out the ongoing impeachment investigation of President Donald Trump. He also serves on the House Rules and House Administration Committee and is a member of the House Democratic Leadership Team. Prior to his time in Congress, Raskin was a 3-term state senator in Maryland, where he served as the Senate Majority Whip. He earned a reputation for building coalitions in Annapolis to deliver a series of landmark legislative accomplishments like marriage equality, abolition of the death penalty, the national popular vote, interstate compact, the freedom of political expression, environmental protection, and restoration of voting rights to former prisoners. Congressman Raskin is a graduate of Harvard College and Harvard Law School. He's the author of several books, including Overruling Democracy, The Supreme Court versus the American People. He and his wife, Sarah Bloom Raskin, live in Tacoma Park with their dogs, Potter and Toby. And they have 3 grown children, Tabitha, Tommy, and Hannah. I also would like to recognize and invoke the name and spirit of someone who has been a deep influence on Congressman Raskin, his late father, Marcus Raskin, who died at age 83 in 2017. Marcus Raskin dedicated his life to peace building, and the study guide I found out that he developed on Vietnam, he dedicated to his son for the teachings in the 1960s that led to the March Against Death of 1969. So tonight, on this Veterans Day weekend, let us honor both those who served and all those who served to end war and violence and save the lives of many. Welcome.
Reverend Abhi, thank you for that beautiful introduction. That means a lot to me. Reverend Kate, wherever you are, thank you for the tea, and thank you for organizing this wonderful forum for us tonight. And thank you for invoking the memory of my late dad, Marcus Raskin. Maybe I'll start with that. My father used to say, when everything looks hopeless, you're the hope. So I'm looking out at a room filled with hope. You are the hope by being here tonight, by hanging tough through 2019 and 2018 and 2017. And in 2022, I've been looking forward to this all week. I spent the week in Washington with the powers that be. Now I'm here at Cedar Lane with the powers that ought to be, the powers that are soon to be. Sometimes I feel like, we're in Trump-occupied Washington during the week. It's very stressful for a lot of people. And then I come back to Montgomery County, to the free state of Maryland. What a pleasure it is to be here at Cedar Lane with Reverend Abhi, Reverend Kate, with all of you, with distinguished elected officials, and with the memory and the spirit of so many great Unitarians. John Adams and Abigail Adams and John Quincy Adams and Louise May Alcott. Those are just the A's that are coming to mind. Thomas Jefferson was a Unitarian. And Millard Fillmore. Thank God for the Unitarians. Thank God for the Unitarians and the Universalists and the merger of the two. I want to dedicate my remarks tonight, such as they are, to our late beloved colleague and friend and leader, Elijah Cummings. I've had a busy weekend, and one of the things I did yesterday was I have a young constituent who's in first grade who turned 7. I think she turned 7. And for her birthday, she wanted to have a march on the White House. There's an article about it in today's Washington Post in the Metro section. You got to check it out. Kyoko's really something. But anyway, so I had something else to do. I couldn't make it to the march, unfortunately. I think that's the first march I've missed since this all got started. But I got to go to the birthday party afterwards. Kyoko and her friends, they made these signs that they passed out that they were holding. And this one quotes Representative Elijah Cummings, and it says, it just kills me. It says, "We've got to guard this moment. This is our watch." And I saw him say that. We were in the Oversight hearing, and he was talking about the corruption and the criminality in the White House. And he said, in a preface to that, he said, "I'm asking the American people to pay attention, to listen up, to wake up. This is our government. We've got to guard this moment. This is our watch." So let's hear it for Elijah Cummings. And let's hear it for Kyoko and the first graders. All right, so I got to start with Tom Paine, because I always start with Tom Paine here at the Unitarian Church, and he wasn't even a Unitarian. It was too much theology and structure for him in the Unitarian Church, so he didn't even make it into the Unitarian Church. But Paine said, "The times have found us. The times have found us." At the time of the revolution, we have to have that same sensibility. We've got to feel the emotional weight of that too. The times have found us. Mary McLeod Bethune said, "If we show the courage and the fortitude that our forefathers and foremothers showed, we can do for our time what they did for their time." And then here's a real Unitarian. I'll quote one, Thomas Jefferson, who said, this is at the time of the writing of the Alien and Sedition Acts, the first big wave of anti-immigrant reaction. And he said, "A little patience, and we shall see the reign of witches pass over. Their spells dissolve, and the people, recovering their true sight, restore their government to its true principles. It is true, in the meantime, we are suffering from debt and war. But we must have patience until our luck turns. And then we will have the possibility of winning back the principles we have lost. For this is a game where principles are at stake." A message from a fellow Unitarian to you guys tonight. I've come tonight to talk about those principles that we've lost or that we are in the danger of losing, and the constitutional role that impeachment plays in vindicating and protecting those principles. Our nation was conceived in revolutionary democratic insurgency against monarchical corruption and despotism, and to establish in its place popular democratic self-government, We overthrew theocracy to establish freedom of worship and conscience and freedom of speech among the people and reason, science, and facts in the operation of government, in the public space. And we overthrew political absolutism and authoritarianism in favor of representative democracy and the rule of law. As Tom Paine put it, in the absolute governments, the king is law, but in the democracies, the law is king. These were great, monumental achievements. Before the idea of America was invented, all power was vested in the monarchs, in the kings and queens, and they got their power directly from God. And how did we know that? Because they told us so. Power flowed from God to the monarchs, and below them, some of it was delegated to the nobility and the church. And then beneath them, beneath that fusion of secular and ecclesiastical power, were the rabble, the peasants, the people, us. That was who was at the bottom. But our founders flipped the whole thing over. They declared that we would have the first government in history where government was created by the people and power flowed exclusively from the consent of the governed, as Jefferson put it in the Declaration of Independence. And the purpose of government was to protect the common good and the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The founders understood the problem of power, which was captured well afterwards by Lord Byron, who said, "Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." They wanted to do what they could to divide power up, to share it, to distribute it, to prevent its concentration in one place. Above all, they feared the tyranny of monarchical power residing in one person. As Madison put it in the Federalist Papers, the convergence of all powers, the collapse of all powers, legislative, executive, judicial, into the hands of one person is the very definition of tyranny. Now, in the distribution of power, in federalism between the states and the federal government, or at the national level among the branches of government, the founders did not believe in the rhetoric of three co-equal branches, which so many of my colleagues fall for and repeat today as a cliche when protesting the most recent depredations and violations of President Trump. If the three branches, which have radically different functions and roles, are in fact equals, then Congress, I submit to you tonight, is clearly the first among equals. And I propose to demonstrate to you why by reviewing the basic constitutional architecture and design. The preamble to the Constitution establishes that the ultimate sovereign creating our government in our nation is the people. Our preamble states, "We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and preserve to ourselves and our posterity the blessings of liberty, do hereby and ordain and establish the Constitution of the United States of America." And the very next sentence that appears is Article 1 of the Constitution, which says, "All legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives." Do you see what just happened there? The sovereign political power of the people to create the Constitution of the country flowed immediately into Congress, the representatives of the people. The phrase checks and balances, which we use so often, appears just once in the Federalist Papers, and it describes the relationship between the Senate and the House, not among the branches. And after the first sentence in Article 1, there are 10 sections in Article 1 spelling out the powers of Congress. 54 paragraphs describing the comprehensive and awesome lawmaking power which resides in the representatives of the people. The power to regulate commerce domestically and internationally. The power to spend money, to make appropriations. The power of taxation. The power to declare war. The power over the seat of government. The power to combat piracy. The power over naturalization and immigration. And then you get to Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, and you get all other powers necessary and proper to the execution of the foregoing powers. And then finally, after all of that, you get to Article 2, which sets forth the executive powers in the president. There are 4 short sections in it. Section 1 sets forth the mode of election of the president in the Electoral College and the oath of office, which the president must swear. I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of the President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. Then you get to Section 2, which establishes that the President is the Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy when called into the actual service of the United States during times of actual insurrection and war. Then you get to Section 3, which provides for the core responsibility of the president to take care that the laws are faithfully executed. Okay? That is the primary job of the President of the United States, to take care that the laws are faithfully executed. And then Section 4 states that so 25% of the sections, okay? 1/4 of the sections is Section 4, which provides that the president, the vice president, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Okay? That's it. Now, let me say something about the laws being faithfully executed. Those of you who are lawyers will recognize in that language the resonance of agency law. The principals are the people, and our representatives are the Congress. It is the job of the president to be the faithful agent of the laws enacted by the Congress, to faithfully execute the laws. It's the same arrangement you get in a business contract, or indeed in legal representation itself. If you ever bought a house, the real estate agent must faithfully execute the will of the purchaser of the house, if that's who they're representing. Now, that's a pretty simple job, okay? Your job is to implement the laws of Congress in time of actual war or conflict, to be the commander-in-chief. You do get to decide whether or not to sign laws or veto them, but guess what? We've got the power to override the veto by 2/3 in each. And by the way, if we were co-equal branches, why is it that the founders said that Congress can impeach the president and the president cannot impeach the Congress? Okay? Why is that? All right. You understand what I'm saying. Under the Articles of Confederation, under the Articles of Association, we didn't even have a president. The presidency was created in order to keep things going when Congress wasn't around, and also to make sure that the people who write the laws are not the same people who are implementing the laws, which the founders saw as a conflict of interest for legislators. They thought that we would most faithfully represent the people if we were behind a kind of Rawlsian veil of ignorance. We weren't able to implement the laws ourselves, so we had to write them as fairly as possible to make sure that everybody would get their fair share. I liken it sometimes for my students to the rule that operates among siblings when cutting pie or cake, which is you cut, I choose, right? You have somebody else do it. You want to make sure the lawmaking power sets forth just laws, and then the executive power faithfully implements what those laws are. Now, I will take it one step further here. The framers went to special pains to define the president not as a king, not as a monarch, not as a dictator or a despot or a tyrant, but as an employee of the people. As an employee of the people. Now think about this for a second, all right? We've got two emoluments clauses in the Constitution. We've got Article 1, Section 9, Clause 8, which is the Foreign Emoluments Clause. And the Foreign Emoluments Clause says that none of us in federal government, neither the president nor members of Congress, no person holding any office of trust under the United States shall, without the consent of Congress, accept a present, an emolument, which means a payment, an office or a title of any kind whatever from a king, a prince, or a foreign state. Period. This is a principle that is so categorical, so clear, and so comprehensive that up until our times, nobody ever came remotely close to violating it. President Lincoln, in the middle of the Civil War, received the gift of two beautiful elephant tusks from the King of Siam, which he loved and he wanted to keep. And in the middle of the Civil War, he felt the obligation, rightfully, to write to Congress to say he had received these, he would like to keep them, could he keep them? And Congress met, formed a little committee, and they came back and they said, Honest Abe, you're doing a great job in the war, but no, unfortunately, we're not going to allow you to keep those tusks. Please turn them over to the Department of Interior. President Andrew Jackson, Donald Trump's big racial nationalist hero, whose portrait is up in the Oval Office, he got a gift of a gold medallion. I think it had his face on it, although I haven't seen it yet, but a gold medallion for Andrew Jackson, custom made for him, that came from Simon Bolivar, who was then the prime minister of Venezuela. And Andrew Jackson, like every other president, felt the need to go ahead and write to the Congress to say, is it all right to keep this? Foreign Emoluments Clause says I can't keep it without the consent of Congress. Congress writes back, sorry, Mr. President, please turn that over to the Department of State. You cannot keep it. So you see, you could just go on and on and on, and then we get to Donald Trump. Okay. Now, President Trump has more than 500 businesses around the world, and when he became president, it was pointed out to him by numerous ethics officials, including President Bush's ethics officer, Richard Painter, that he needed to divest himself of all of these businesses or else announce that he would not accept any money from foreign governments. Well, he refused to divest himself of his businesses. He refused to announce a rule that he would not accept money from foreign governments. He refused to put everything in a blind trust. He refused to end his ownership and control over the businesses, but he did say that he would put Eric Trump and Donald Trump Jr. in day-to-day management of the businesses, okay? Otherwise, nothing has changed. He has stayed in private business from the very beginning. Now, in Article 2, Section 1, Clause 7, it is stated that the president must receive a fixed salary compensation, which may be neither increased nor decreased by Congress during the president's term of office. And the president may receive no other emoluments from the government of the United States or of any state. That's the provision that defines him as an employee. He gets a salary. It can't be increased or decreased to penalize him or to induce him to do something. And he can't collect any other money from the government. That's a very important anti-monarchy statement by the founders. The kings and the queens treated their governments as private property. They could take from the governments whatever they wanted. Well, that's not the way it works in democracy. So, The president has violated both clauses from day one. He has collected millions of dollars from Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Turkey, Egypt, Philippines, at least 27 countries that we're aware of. A rogues gallery of kings, princes, autocrats, kleptocrats, despots, and tyrants, precisely what the founders wanted to prevent. That was exactly what they didn't want. They wanted the president to have a complete, undivided, absolute fiduciary duty and obligation to the people of the country, and not to Russian autocrats and oligarchs and Ukrainian prosecutors and investigators and Saudi murderers and on down the list. They wanted the president to have loyalty to the American people. This president has collected millions of dollars at the hotels, at the golf courses, at the resorts, at the restaurants, from Ireland to Scotland to Mar-a-Lago to Virginia to New Jersey to the headquarters of all the corruption in Washington, D.C., the Trump National Hotel, which I call the Washington Emolument. And it should be a stop on all the tour buses. But you know what? You don't have to take my word for it, because the president has admitted it. The president wrote a check of $340,000 to the U.S. Treasury saying this is what accounts, according to Donald Trump, for the profits at his hotels from foreign governments, princes, and kings. Now think about that for a second, okay? There are a few problems with that. The first problem is the Constitution does not say that the president cannot accept profits from foreign governments. It says that the president may not accept payments from foreign governments of any kind whatsoever, okay? The second problem with it is that the president announced only the profits from his hotels, as if the golf courses and the hundreds of other business enterprises are somehow exempted from the Emoluments Clause, and I'm not quite sure where that doctrine came from. The third problem, of course, is that he provided no documentation of any of it. So if you're willing to believe Donald Trump about how much he owes, then maybe this solution works for you. It might not work for the rest of the American public. But the big problem is he cannot accept one dime of it without coming to Congress first, because our consent is necessary. Now, it's the same thing with the Domestic Emoluments Clause. Every time they fly down to Mar-a-Lago, they're spending around $75,000 to $100,000 at the hotel that comes from the Secret Service or the Executive Office of the President or the Department of Defense or the Department of State. This is a president who has spent more than 1/3 of his days at his own properties. So they've spent millions of dollars in federal tax dollars at the president's businesses. And this has gone on for so long, he actually believed he could get away with hosting the G7 summit at the Trump Doral National Resort in Florida, which was described in one magazine as a second-rate golf course at a third-rate hotel. But he thought this was, as you know, the perfect place to bring the foreign governments over, to spend millions of dollars here to go into the Trump organization, and then also to channel millions of dollars, again, from federal departments and agencies right into the Trump Hotel. Now, my district includes Frederick County, and I represent the good people of Thurmont, whose economy is heavily affected by Camp David. I don't know if there are any Thurmont people here tonight. This is where we had the last American G7 summit. The president's White House chief of staff went on TV to announce how horrible and dreadful it was without citing any authority to that. But I went and spent some time with my constituents up in Frederick County who suggested, and this was right after the president announced that he had a plan to bring the Taliban over to Thurmont, to Camp David. They said, well, you know, Mr. President, why don't you bring the G7 to Thurmont and bring the Taliban to the Trump National Doral Resort in Florida? In any event, he can't be spending taxpayer dollars at his hotels or resorts if he's right that it's the perfect place to do it. And he's being honest, of course, that he's worth billions of dollars. He would have no problem making the donation to the American people instead of having the American people unconstitutionally make the donation to him. And that's what's been taking place. Now, I raise this because this has become the paradigm for how the president does business. The president has converted the presidency into an instrument of private profit and self-enrichment. And it has given him the idea that he can do whatever he wants. In fact, I'm not making that up. He said he was told by his lawyers that Article 2 of the Constitution, which I read to you, allows him to do whatever he wants. It's not about taking care that the laws are faithfully executed. It allows him to do whatever he wants. In other words, this is just a great gig for him. It's a magnificent get-rich-quick scheme that he was able to orchestrate with a little help from his friends who got involved in our 2016 campaign. So now the president believes that he can use the presidency and the government of the United States to guarantee his reelection and to cement his hold on political power. He's converted not only the presidency, but the government and the foreign policy of the United States into an instrument of reelection and political manipulation and election interference by foreign governments. He organized a systematic shakedown of President Zelensky and the Ukrainian government to extract from them two things. One, confirmation of the discredited Russian disinformation conspiracy theory that it was not Russia at all which had engaged in the sweeping and systematic campaign that Special Counsel Mueller described to subvert and undermine election. It was Ukraine that did it. And Vladimir Putin has been falsely accused here. And we're going to clear it up by getting the Ukrainian government to confess that this was a Ukraine operation all along. And the second thing that they want is a full-blown criminal investigation of Joe Biden and Hunter Biden, and they want it to be announced on national TV in America by President Zelensky. And in order to perpetrate this scheme, he deputized Rudy Giuliani and Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, Fruman, I'm forgetting it, Fruman and Parnas and Fruman to go over there. Now, Parnas and Fruman are actually clients of Rudy Giuliani. You would think they are like paralegals or interns on the Giuliani legal team, but actually they're clients of his, which means they're paying Giuliani. Well, who's paying Parnas and Fruman? Well, it's a Russian oligarch who's paying them to be doing what they're doing. And as far as we can tell, I'm going to try to reconstruct the exact trail of money here. It sounds like a little bit of a conflict of interest, or perhaps it's a convergence of interest that's taking place there. But in any event, the president is using this team and used this team in order to target the United States ambassador to Ukraine, Ambassador Masha Yovanovitch, with an unprecedented smear campaign, a propaganda campaign organized by Giuliani and by Trump to target her, calling her a tool and a mole for George Soros, and someone who was promoting corruption when in fact she's devoted her entire career to fighting corruption and to trying to advance liberal democracy. But suddenly we've got this shadow operation working at cross purposes with the U.S. government and with all of the State Department personnel and military personnel who, at great personal risk and with great personal courage, have come forward against the threats of the White House, against the intimidation of the White House, to render honest and truthful testimony. And we have seen it over the last several weeks. And this week, America is going to get to see the beginning of the public hearings about what took place in Ukraine and what the president and Giuliani were doing. Now, this parade of witnesses that have come in, and these people are heroes. They will go down in American history as heroes. This parade of witnesses tells a story which is uncontradicted. There's no rival hypothesis out there unless you want to say that all of the paranoid conspiracy theories were right. But if you agree with the fact that they've been absolutely refuted and discredited, there's no other story about what's happened, which is why our colleagues across the aisle have turned instead to attack the process. They have been whining about the process from the very beginning. So the first thing that they said was that it was illegitimate for us to be conducting an impeachment investigation without a vote on the floor of the House of Representatives. But of course, the Constitution delegates to the House of Representatives the sole power of impeachment. We can set it up however we like to set it up. And the Chief Judge of the United States District Court for the District of Columbia stated that 2 weeks ago, that of course it's up to the House of Representatives how it wants to set up its impeachment proceedings, but they thought there was something wrong with the fact that there wasn't a vote on the House floor. So we had a vote on the House floor to authorize the proceedings and to define the procedure going forward. Well, then they turned to civil disobedience. Now, it's the first civil disobedience waged in American history for high crimes and misdemeanors, okay? But they came barging into the closed-door deposition in the SCIF, in the secure facility in the basement of the House of Representatives. And it was quite an odd intervention because they were claiming they were closed out of the hearing, but in fact the Republicans from the beginning have had 50% of the time for questions. They've been equally represented in the ability of staff to ask questions and members to ask questions. Some of them had to leave the table where they were preparing to ask questions to go out to participate in the press conference, to come back and sit in and claim that they'd been excluded, okay? So the public saw through that. They were not exactly freedom riders and hunger strikers with the pepperoni pizza they brought in with themselves to come and obstruct our investigation for 4.5 hours. But we had a vote on the floor, and we authorized public hearings going forward. So first they were denouncing secret closed-door hearings. The moment we announced that there were going to be public hearings, because we want nothing more than for the American public to hear all of these witnesses, Donald Trump has a press conference saying there should be no public hearings. And I don't blame him for that. I think he understands the dynamics a lot better than the members do who were calling for public hearings. I don't know what they're going to say at this point. Maybe their best bet is to say, yes, the president organized a systematic shakedown of a foreign government to interfere in our election. Yes, the president helped to sabotage a United States ambassador and undermine the U.S. foreign policy of America in order to promote political and financial corruption in Ukraine. He did all of that, but it's not impeachable. It's not really bad like something, Bill Clinton did, okay? A lot of these are people who were huge champions of the impeachment of President Bill Clinton, who I admit to you was guilty of what I call low crimes and misdemeanors, okay? The president, in that case, was guilty of not insidious and criminal affairs of state, but insidious affairs of the heart, okay? And I'm not certain that's what the framers had in mind. The language that we read to you in Article 2, Section 4 says that the president shall be impeached for treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Well, treason and bribery are all about betrayal of the country, right? When you make common alliances with the enemies of the American people. Bribery is when you sell out the American people, the interests of the American people, in order to promote somebody else's interests. So this sets up a common theme in the impeachment clause, that it's about betrayal of the country, the kind of betrayal that we saw in this shakedown, which had elements of extortion, elements of bribery itself, and elements of betrayal of our national security at the same time. In other words, what this president did was the most impeachable thing that any American president has ever done. Okay? All right, so I don't want to sound too partisan, okay? So I want to close by invoking our last great Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, who spoke of government of the people, by the people, and for the people. He spoke those beautiful words from the Gettysburg battlefield in 1863. He asked the question whether government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall endure or shall perish from the earth. And he meant it. And he asked us to go back to the very beginning, not the Constitution, but the Declaration. 77 years ago, 87 years, that goes back to 1776. Our fathers brought forth on this nation brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty, and dedicated the proposition that all men, and we can add women, are created equal. That was the vision. And in order to keep it going, we have to keep the trajectory of democracy moving. You can read our whole constitutional experiment as an expansion of the franchise, a deepening of democratic rights, a spreading out of who the polity is. We've only had 17 amendments since the Constitution was written and the Bill of Rights were added, and most of them have been about expanding democracy. The Civil War was the critical moment. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment gave us equal protection and due process. In the states, the 15th Amendment banned race discrimination in voting. The 17th Amendment shifted the mode of election from the state legislatures to the people themselves. The 19th Amendment, whose 100th anniversary we celebrate next year, gave us women's suffrage. And yes, ERA now, starting with Virginia and our friends in Virginia. The 23rd Amendment gave people in Washington, D.C. the right to participate in presidential elections, although they still can't participate in congressional elections. The 24th Amendment banned poll taxes, and the 26th Amendment lowered the voting age to 18. You see, the whole trajectory of our political development is towards greater democracy. We've got to get the engines of democracy moving again to bring more people in, to deepen the meaning of democracy. And we got to get rid of the Electoral College and move to a national popular vote for President of the United States. And we've got to end voter suppression. And we need statehood for our friends in Washington, D.C. We need statehood for the people in Puerto Rico. We've got to keep democracy moving. Tocqueville saw this very clearly. He said, either democracy is expanding and growing, or it's contracting, and it's going to atrophy. He wrote about it when he came over and wrote Democracy in America. So we know what our historical assignment is. We have to counter and confront and manage the threats to the Constitution right now, all of the high crimes and misdemeanors. And then we've got to make sure this never happens again by continuing to expand democracy and demonstrating the civic vigilance that we need. James Madison said, "Those who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power that knowledge gives." Are you willing to arm yourselves with that power? That's the question. That's the question. I'm gonna leave you with the words of two of our great Democratic heroes. And then, I don't know, are we doing question and answer? We are? Oh, good, okay. So I'm not really leaving you, but let me close with these thoughts then. All right. One is the great Frederick Douglass, a fellow Marylander, born 45 minutes away at the Wye River Plantation as a slave who taught himself to read on the sly, escaped from slavery to become our great abolitionist freedom fighter and leader and hero, spent a lot of time himself in the Unitarian churches of the day. And Douglass said, if there's no struggle, there is no progress. The struggle may be moral, it may be material, it may be moral and material, but there must be struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, and it never will. There's a message to you from a fellow Marylander in the 19th century, okay? And I leave you finally with the words I've held so close to my heart. I hope you know them by heart by now too. And I've updated the language a little bit at the request of Speaker Pelosi, just so it doesn't offend modern sensibilities, and it sounds a lot better this way anyway. And Paine, in 1776, he came over to support our revolution. He said America would become a beacon to the world. He said it would become an asylum for humanity. Not an insane asylum, mind you. An asylum for humanity. He said it would be a haven of refuge for people fleeing religious and political repression from all over the world. That's who we are. He would love what you're doing here at Cedar Lane. And so Paine came to fight with us. He came to fight with us and to put his mind and his body in the struggle for democracy. And you think it's bad today? It was really bad back then because there weren't a lot of examples to fall back on. And he said, everybody's running around asking, who's our leader? And what's the message? We need the message, And there are too many people running, and there's too many, and all of that stuff. So he wanted to write a pamphlet that would bring people together. And he wrote this series called The Crisis and Common Sense. And in it, he said this. He said, these are the times that try men and women's souls. These are the times that try men and women's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will shrink at this moment from the service of their cause and their country. But everyone who stands with us now will win the love and the favor and the affection of every man and every woman for all time. Tyranny like hell is not easily conquered, but we have this saving consolation. The more difficult the struggle, the more glorious in the end is our victory. That victory will be ours. Thank you, Cedar Lane. So thank you. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Thank you, Cedar Lane. Thank you, Reverend Avi.
Thank you. Thank you, Congressman Raskin. When I reached out to Congressman Raskin asking if he would consider doing a speech, he immediately agreed and said that he would like to use this moment to lay out some of the reasoning, the principles, the prospect, and also the framework about the impeachment. So thank you for really making a compelling case this evening. Now we have quite a few questions, and I'm going to try and get through as many as possible and that you are willing to address. And I'm going to begin with this question: shouldn't we limit the scope of the impeachment inquiry so we can move on to other issues?
Well, I certainly agree that we got to get back to the business of the people. I think that's what impeachment is all about. We have more than 200 bills that we passed out of the House of Representatives that are sitting on Mitch McConnell's desk tonight. In February, we passed the Universal Criminal and Mental Background Check bill so that we would expand the Brady legislation so nobody could buy a firearm without a background check. That's supported by more than 95% of the American people. We've got an internet loophole, we got a private gun show loophole, we got the parking lot of the 7-Eleven loophole. People are out there selling guns to people and buying guns without any background check at all. And in H.R. 8, we passed the legislation back in February to get it done, and it's sitting there on McConnell's desk. There have been no hearings about it. There have been no markups about it. Nothing has happened. It's the same thing with prescription drug reform, which is a crisis in the lives of so many families across America. There are people who are paying 5 or 6 or up to 10 times more for prescription drugs that are made in America than people are paying in other countries. And we said, no, the prescription drug companies have got to charge people what they're being charged in 5 countries, the average of 5 countries, which include Canada and the UK, France, Japan, and Germany. And we also empowered, in our legislation, the government of the United States to negotiate for lower prescription drug prices against Big Pharma in the Medicare program. And that's a power that we've got in Medicaid. It's a power we got in the VA. The only reason we don't have it in the Medicare is because a special interest provision was slipped in by the then chairman of the committee, Billy Towson, who, what do you know, the next year went off and became the president of Big Pharma after he left the Congress. So it's a Washington story. But there are things we can do to bring down the price of prescription drug reform, and it's sitting on Mitch McConnell's desk. And it's the same with the $15 minimum wage that we passed out of the House of Representatives. And it's the same with the anti-gerrymandering bill that we passed, which obligates every state in the union to end gerrymandering and instead substitute for it an independent redistricting commission made up of citizens. So you name it, we've done it in the House, and we want them to get back to business. The first time they showed any vague interest in doing any of that stuff is when we moved for impeachment, and they said, let's get back to business. Let's see if they really want to get back to business. But look, the preamble of the Constitution says we are there to promote the general welfare. That's what we've got to do. But the Constitution also says that we must be vigilant and zealous in defending the rule of law and preventing the president from committing high crimes and misdemeanors against the people. We've sworn an oath of office to uphold the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and we're going to do it.
Will anything in Robert Mueller's report be used as grounds for impeachment? If so, what will be used?
I certainly hope so, because, we didn't even talk about this. Thank you for that question. The president has been systematically, categorically, and in an unprecedented way obstructing justice. He has ordered everybody in the executive branch not to cooperate with our impeachment investigation and also lots of other investigations, like Chairman Cummings launched an investigation into the White House Personnel Office's granting of security clearances to more than 25 people who'd been denied security clearances by the professional staff in the White House, and then President Trump or one of his political subordinates overrode them and said, we're going to give you security clearance. That's how Jared Kushner got one, by the way. But there were people who, because of conflicts of interest with foreign governments or business conflicts of interest, could not get them. And everybody who was involved in it was ordered by the White House not to participate, not to turn over the documents we're asking for, and not to produce the witnesses that we've asked for. My friends, a subpoena from the Congress of the United States is not an optional thing. It's not like an invitation to a Christmas party, okay? If you're subpoenaed by Congress, you go. You come, you participate. Everybody owes the sovereign his or her honest, truthful testimony. So, to answer the question, there are at least 8 or 9 episodes of obstruction of justice, very specific episodes of witness tampering, witness coaching, blockading of witnesses and evidence by President Trump that are in Volume 2 of the Mueller report, and that should be part of all of the evidence we have as recently as this week and this coming, next week, that the president is trying to stop people from giving honest testimony to Congress. This is not a game between the legislative and the executive branch. The president has made up a new phrase, absolute immunity. Absolute immunity is an absolute joke, okay? The president does not have the power, he does not have some kind of invisible cloak he can bring down over people in the executive branch to keep them from rendering their honest testimony to the representatives of the people. This is a representative democracy. We're going to vindicate the basic principles of our Constitution.
Will the principal impeachment count be based on bribery, violation of the Hobbs Act?
So that's an interesting question. As you know, a high crime and misdemeanor does not have to be defined as a specific federal statutory offense. It can be a statutory offense, but it doesn't have to be. And I think the short answer to your question is it remains to be seen exactly whether we define it in statutory terms, in constitutional terms, as both in statutory and constitutional terms. It's not perfectly clear at this point how we're going to do it, and there's still a lot more factual evidence coming out. But you are right to recognize this as a form of solicitation of bribery, inducement to bribery, and it's also possibly an inducement to an emolument, right? In other words, the president says, give me this present, which is banned constitutionally, give me this present of this manufactured political dirt I want on my opponent, and then you will get the military aid that Congress has voted for you.
This question, please clarify, did Trump break a specific law? I know that he does not have to be impeached.
So let's see. On the first part of that, multiple laws have been broken, multiple constitutional provisions have been violated, and we're in the process of compiling all of them. Obviously, I've suggested a bunch of them tonight in my question. He does not have to be impeached in the sense that impeachment is designed by the framers as a mixed question of law and politics. It's law because there's a legal standard of treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors. That's a legal standard, and we have a constitutional obligation to adhere to it, to elucidate what we mean by it, and to spell out how we think it's been violated if it has been. It's political in this sense. The decision maker is the Congress of the United States. The framers debated whether or not impeachment and trial and conviction and removal should be organized in the judicial branch. And they specifically decided not to. They thought it was too serious a thing to put merely in the judiciary. They thought it needed to go with the representatives of the people. So we have an awesome constitutional responsibility. It's a very heavy weight here to live up to both the law and then the politics of the moment. And the politics of the moment go back to, I think, what the first question was. As representatives, we have to fit this in with everything else we're doing. We have to fit it in to fighting for gun safety. We have to fit it in to trying to deal with climate change against an administration which pulled the plug on the Paris Climate Accord. We've got to balance this with everything else we're trying to advance for the American people. And by the way, we got to keep the government open against a president who has before used the shutting down of the government as political leverage and as a threat against his perceived political opponents. So that makes this situation very complex. And so we have to deal with the legal imperatives of the situation as well as the complicated political context that we're in.
The next couple of questions speak about the Senate's role. If the House passes articles of impeachment, does the Senate have to bring it up on the floor for hearings and or vote? And how does an impeachment trial work?
So each House shapes the rules of its own proceedings. The House gets to define the rules of procedure for the impeachment process. The Senate gets to define the rules of procedure for the trial process. But there are certainly textual constitutional indications of what's expected there. The Supreme Court in a case called U.S. versus Nixon found that it was a non-justiciable political question, meaning it's up to the Senate to define the rules. You can't appeal, as the president seems to think you can, from a conviction in the Senate to the Supreme Court. Somebody should explain to him. I'm not sure if Rudy Giuliani is the one to understand it, but maybe there's someone in the White House who can explain to him you cannot appeal from impeachment and conviction in the Senate. It doesn't work like that. So the Senate is going to design its own rules. Senator McConnell has said that he believes that there must be a trial. I think it's a bit ambiguous whether he would accept motions to dismiss on the evidence at the beginning or motions to dismiss as a matter of law. He originally had made some suggestions that that's what he might do, and they might try and do that. They might try and save the senators from having to vote on the ultimate guilt or innocence of the president on the various charges by saying that, there's, for some reason, as a matter of law, it should be settled peremptorily. I don't know whether that would be politically digestible to people or not, but there have been some suggestions that they may try and do it. But I want to say this. Some people have said they don't understand why those of us in the House feel strongly about meeting our oaths in this way if we know that there are not enough Republican senators to vote to convict. I don't know that in any way. I don't know how anybody in the Senate is going to vote, with the possible exception of Lindsey Graham, who said he would not read anything about it and not study the evidence, which I think is basically a dereliction of duty and a statement that he's not meeting his oath of office. But look, our colleagues across the aisle in the House tend to represent extremely red gerrymandered districts, which unfortunately they want to protect as gerrymandered districts. But in the Senate, it's a different story. There are a lot more senators like Susan Collins or Cory Gardner, Republicans who represent states with millions of Democrats and independents in there too. And so they are going to have to pay a lot more attention to their constitutional duties. If over the next several weeks, America is as amazed and riveted and dismayed by the testimony, the uncontradicted testimony of these witnesses, as we have been watching it, then we may see further dramatic shifts in public opinion. Already, we have a majority of the American people who favor the inquiry. According to Fox News, we have a majority of the American people who favor impeachment and removal. At the same equivalent time, during the Richard Nixon Watergate process, 19% of the people favored impeachment. So already the public has turned dramatically against the president. But over the next few weeks, if the president suffers another 5 or 10 point loss in approval and shift in support towards impeachment, a lot of those Republican senators might decide to take their constitutional oaths a lot more seriously as they enter into this process. And remember this, according to the framers, it's a majority vote in the House in order to prosecute, in order to bring the case over, to impeach the president. it's a two-thirds vote in the Senate to convict, which makes it harder to convict. But when people say it's going to be so difficult to convict, that might be right. But it might not be so difficult to get a majority of the Senate to say that the president is guilty. Do they really want to elect as their nominee? Do they really want to nominate someone for president who's been impeached by the House and then voted as guilty of crimes by a majority of the Senate? That's up to them. That's totally up to them. But we at least want America to understand we are performing our duty constitutionally, and we are presenting to the American people what we know about the conduct of this president.
Thank you. This is a question regarding the disqualification element of impeachment. Could Trump be impeached, convicted, removed from office, but still end up on the ballot for the 2020 GOP candidate?
That's a great question, and it's totally up to the Senate. It is up to the Senate to decide whether this would be one of the collateral consequences of conviction in the Senate. He could be barred from holding future civil office under the Constitution, or they could decide not to. That's completely up to the Senate to decide, as essentially the judge and the jury over there.
This question: if facts are in dispute, example Trump's state of mind, what standard of proof should the Senate apply?
Well, let's start with this. I don't think there's any dispute about the president's state of mind, okay? The president, in terms of the model penal code, had the highest level of culpability. He deliberately acted to shake them down. There was no negligence here. There was no accident. It wasn't even something that he wasn't quite sure about. He was very deliberately focused on conducting a shakedown of the Ukrainian government. I don't know if the suggestion is that the president lacks capacity, and some people have suggested that takes us down a different constitutional route, which is the 25th Amendment. But I feel like the ship has sailed on that question, at least for the majority in the House. I did introduce legislation in the last Congress, which had, I think, 75 co-sponsors, to set up a commission under the 25th Amendment. Section 4 of the 25th Amendment says the vice president and a majority of the cabinet can determine that there's incapacity of the president for mental or physical reasons, or the vice president and a majority of a body set up by Congress. It's pretty clear that the cabinet under Trump won't do it, either because they're too cowed and intimidated by the president, or because there are too many vacancies and too many of them are acting secretaries, and that might not be a coincidence, by the way. But in any event, we do have a kind of separation of powers principle built into Section 4 of the 25th Amendment, such that Congress can establish a body, and I proposed a body that would be made up half of former executive branch officers, including former presidents, vice presidents, attorneys general, secretaries of defense, and so on, and half physicians and psychiatrists, mental health professionals that would be able to meet and would be able to act. It would be completely bipartisan and bicameral, but it would allow Congress to play a role there. We could get no Republicans to sign on to it. Some Republicans have started to talk about it. According to this week's news, apparently Vice President Pence said he would act under the 25th Amendment if there was a cabinet quorum to do it. We keep hearing reports about it, but nobody ever does anything, and then they deny it later. So I don't know whether that could happen. But the burden would be on the Republicans to move it at this point. They didn't do it before the impeachment process began in earnest and before these particular high crimes and misdemeanors were committed. The standard under impeachment is high crimes and misdemeanors. The standard under the 25th Amendment is capacity. And think of it like a Venn diagram. It's possible that you're incapacitated, but you're not committing high crimes and misdemeanors. It's possible you're committing high crimes and misdemeanors, but you're not incapacitated. Then there's that special group in the middle, which which may be eligible for constitutional treatment under both provisions. Let's put it like that. So, was there a second part to that question?
No.
No, okay. So, yeah.
This questioner asks, given that nearly 100% of House Democrats voted for the rules of impeachment, which gave supreme power to the committee chair, Mr. Schiff, while 100% of Republicans voted against these rules, how is it possible to view the process as other than 100% partisan?
Well, you don't determine the partisan character of legislation by who votes for it or not, I don't think. Obviously, the vote turned out to be partisan. On the Republican side, it was completely partisan. On our side, we had the Democrats and the independents together, because Justin Amash voted with us. And he was exiled from the Republican Party after he read the Mueller report and said that a reasonable person cannot read the Mueller report without concluding that there were high crimes and misdemeanors committed by the president. And then that's when he was basically drummed out of the party and turned into an independent. I think that the process should be evaluated and assessed for the character of the process itself. It's 50% questioning by the Republicans, 50% questioning by the Democrats. We've gone public as quickly as possible. We want the whole public to see it. And then when all of the information in the fact investigations has come out, it is turned over to the Judiciary Committee in order to assess whether high crimes and misdemeanors, in fact, should be charged and how it should be organized. So the process follows very closely what took place in the Clinton impeachment, what took place in the Nixon impeachment. In the Clinton impeachment, there were, I think, 32 Democrats who voted for the rules of procedure for the Clinton impeachment. And so I believe, at least when it comes to impeachments, the Democrats have acted in a much more bipartisan way than the Republicans have acted. But I think you've got to keep your eyes on the merits of what's being said rather than this idea that, well, we'll mobilize everybody to be in a partisan camp and then declare that the process is a partisan one. I think the public can see through that game.
Thank you. This questioner asks, can you give us any hints as to the Democrats' strategy to educate the public on the legitimacy, constitutionality of the impeachment process?
Well, this is the strategy.
Right.
You're seeing the strategy. So, we're out there all the time in our districts. We're out there all the time on the radio. We're out there all the time on TV. You may have noticed I've been overexposed recently on television, but we are all going out to talk about what the process is and to educate people because of that Madisonian point that the people need to be educated in order to exercise the power here for real. And it's an opportunity to educate young people about the Constitution and the premises of democracy. And believe me, the young people are watching carefully. I went and spoke to a Boy Scout troop yesterday, and I was on my best bipartisan, nonpartisan behavior. I described it in very neutral terms, the different branches of government and the Constitution. And then I finished up, and then a kid raised his hand and he said, "Are you going to get rid of Donald Trump for committing all those crimes?" So the kids know what's going on, and they're watching us. They're watching us.
How do we pressure the Republican senators to impeach?
Well, look, we're in a process here, and it's an educational process, and we just need everybody focused on the hearings. Don't fall for the diversions. Don't fall for the distractions. Don't fall for, fake sit-in protests by people who never had a good word to say about the sit-in protesters, okay? Don't fall for any of that stuff. Keep your eyes on the prize of the actual witnesses and the actual testimony. It's all about what we learn about what took place. That's what we're going to try to do. And we're going to try to resist every opportunity to create circus-like theatrics in the committee rooms and in Congress. And so email and text your friends who live in other states. mobilize everybody to pay attention to what is happening and make sure that we're engaging with the solemnity and the seriousness of this enterprise. We are defending our democracy. And you know what? We're not just defending it for Maryland or for America. All over the world, liberal democracies are under attack. The despots and the tyrants and the strongmen have found each other. Putin in Russia, and Orban in Hungary, and Duterte in the Philippines, and Sisi in Egypt, and Erdogan in Turkey, and the homicidal Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, and there's authoritarianism in governments all over the world. We're seeing it in China against the Uyghurs. We're seeing it
in India.
We're seeing it in India. We're seeing it all over the world. So this is not just for us. We have got to stand up for democracy and human rights all over the world.
Just a couple more questions. If we should impeach because clear high crimes, etc., have been committed, but polls indicate it could backfire, that get Trump reelected, should we still do it?
My friends, I'm past that point. For me, I'm not thinking in electoral terms for 1 minute about this. We have sworn a constitutional oath. All of us, Democrats, Republicans, Independent, all of us have sworn a constitutional oath. I pray, I hope, I trust that everybody will live up to their oath. At the same time, I'm spending every minute I can to build for a massive electoral repudiation for the legislative negligence and recklessness of this administration and the Republicans in Congress. I'm fighting to take back the U.S. Senate and the White House and to expand our majority in the House of Representatives. But, those things are on two different tracks. They're on two different tracks, and I hope that we are able to do our job in 2019, and we're able to meet our constitutional duties, that the Senate will be able to act quickly to conduct a fair trial with complete due process protections for the president, and that we will be able to get through it, and then we will be able to have a fair election. But one reason I feel so strongly about this is because the president's alleged high crimes and misdemeanors are against our election. They're all about getting a foreign power to get involved in our election. So how can we close our eyes to that and say, well, no, we can't conduct an impeachment proceeding, we're too close to the election? That will just invite more interference in our elections in the future. The way that a failure to act on what happened to us in 2016 would appear to be an invitation to make it happen again in 2020. It's all about we the people. It's our election. It doesn't belong to the government of the United States, much less the government of Russia or the government of Ukraine or Saudi Arabia or any other government on earth. It's the American people's election. That's the principle we're fighting for.
And this last question, once Trump is impeached, how long do you estimate before sanity reigns again?
Well, the generations to come will marvel in disbelief at what we are living through on a daily basis here. Let's hope we get to a point where they marvel at what's happened here. But I want to say that the sanity began at the very beginning. The very beginning. Donald Trump got sworn in on January 20th, 2017. And I don't know how many of you guys went to the inauguration. I couldn't make it myself for that day. I watched it on TV, and I enjoyed it just fine. I would have preferred it if it had been in the original Russian that it arrived in. But for me, this period began not on January 20th, 2017. It was January 21, 2017, with the Great Women's March on Washington. The Great Women's March on Washington. And that was the moment when the three glorious words that kick off our Constitution came alive for me. We the people. That's when we reasserted the proper relationship between the people and the government. Those of us who aspire and attain to public office are nothing but the servants of the people. Nothing but the servants of the people. And the minute that we begin to act like the masters of the people, like the kings and queens and monarchs that our country was organized against, that's the moment to evict, reject, eject, impeach, convict, and remove from office, okay? So the sanity has been here. The sanity is building every day. The sanity and the education are spreading. We're going to take our country back. We're going to make America America again. And then we're going to go ahead and make the structural adjustments, the constitutional changes in America, like with the Electoral College, like with statehood for people in Puerto Rico and D.C. We're going to make the democratic changes we need to make sure this never happens again to us. Thank you very much, everybody.
I'd like to offer our deep gratitude to Congressman Jamie Raskin for making time to be with us here tonight, and especially would like to thank our staff and many members of Cedar Lane who have really worked hard to make this event happen. So thank you, and thank you for being here tonight. You said something at the end, Congressman Raskin, and reminded me of Langston Hughes' poem, America. So friends, before we break for tonight, I would just like to leave you with these words that I would invite you to hold. The steel of freedom does not stain from those who live like leeches on the people's lives. We must take back our land again, America. Oh yes, I say it plain, America never was America to me, and yet I swear this oath, America will be. Out of the rack and ruin of our gangster death, the rape and rot of graft and stealth and lies, we, the people, must redeem the land, the mines, the plants, the rivers, the mountains, and the endless plain, all the stretch of these great green straits, and make America again. Yeah. Go in peace.